second episode of What Do You Think, Utah? I'm Bill Allred, and I'll moderate tonight's discussion about the police and the people. But first, let me just remind you all about what we're trying to accomplish with this series of public conversations about topics that matter to you, or they should matter to you. And if they don't matter to you, then you should tell us that they don't matter to you.
Plus, you're in the wrong
place. Tell us what does matter to you. Give us some idea of the topics that you want to talk about on What Do You Think, Utah? Now, as I said last month, we promise with these shows that we won't suck up to politicians. We won't suck up to big business. We won't suck up to the left or to the right. And we won't suck up to anybody. We promise to question everything, and we promise to ask the questions that you want us to ask of the people who make the decisions that affect your lives. Tonight's show, by the way, is being interpreted by some sign language interpreters over here. Vi Kawa and Haley Millay are interpreting the show tonight, and it is being live streamed over the internet. Now, when I was a kid, I was taught that the police were your friends. The cop on the corner was there to help you if you were in trouble. And it really was he. That cop was he in those days. I don't think there were any women cops that I knew of back then. He was officer friendly, and I believed that. And I think it was largely true for me, a young white boy growing up in the mostly white neighborhoods of then mostly white Ogden, Utah. But I suspect that there were some kids in other parts of Ogden back then who didn't take such a benign view of the local police. Kids who grew up in the neighborhoods west of Washington Boulevard and even further across the tracks and over the viaduct. I dare say that their interactions with the law were probably more frequent than mine, and probably a little bit less cordial than mine. Even all those years ago, they didn't really view the police as officer friendly. Maybe some of those West Side kids knew a bit more of what people in Ferguson, Missouri know now, or people in Baltimore or New York or other communities where violence has been flaring between the police and the people. Not since the urban riots of the 1960s have we seen such an uptick of mayhem in the streets of American cities. Our city, Salt Lake, has remained really relatively calm. There have been incidents in the city proper and in some of the outlying communities which could have sparked violence, but it hasn't really happened. Well, tonight we've gathered a panel, and I know that there are people here in the audience tonight who would like to talk about how we have maintained the peace here in Salt Lake City, and about how we can continue to maintain peace in Salt Lake City. But let's first introduce tonight's panel. Bruce Baird over here on the end is a prominent real estate and litigation lawyer in Salt Lake who's also been politically active for several years in the Democratic Party as a candidate for the United States Congress and the United States Senate. He's also managed and been on the senior staff on the campaigns for governor, U.S. Senate, U.S. House of Representatives, Salt Lake City Mayor, Salt Lake County Commission, and other elected offices. As a lawyer, Bruce appears frequently before numerous cities, towns, and counties. He's written columns and articles for City Weekly. He was a frequent talking head on the Van Oka Group on Channel 4. He just had to run over to Channel 2 before this and do a little bit about prison relocation. He also...
You were talking about Chaffetz?
He also holds a patent, which if you'd like him to explain that to you, he'll explain it to you, and then the next time you see him, you'll say, now, what is that patent you hold? And he'll explain it again, and you still won't remember what it's all about. It's Bruce Baird. Next is Dr. Rob Butters. I know this is a very white panel we have, by the way. The Reverend France Davis was supposed to be with us this evening, and the Reverend Davis, and I hope there's nothing serious, but he came for just a few minutes, and he had said earlier, I have to take my wife to a doctor's appointment, and then I'll do that, and then I'll come and be on the panel. He came just a few minutes ago and said, I can't stay. And so I hope it's nothing serious, but he had to leave and attend to some issue. So the Reverend France Davis was going to be here and make this a less white panel than it is tonight. But now let's introduce Dr. Rob Butters. He's an assistant professor, chair of forensic social work, and the director of the Utah Criminal Justice Center at the University of Utah and the College of Social Work. He teaches advanced practice courses and research in the graduate school. Dr. Butters speaks locally and nationally on forensic social work and the welfare of children and families. He's the clinical director of Life Matters Counseling and Health Center and has worked clinically with children and families for over 20 years in the public and private sectors. Rob has a BS in psychology, a master's of social work, and a PhD in social work from the University of Utah. Next, we have Dave Owen. Dave is a political consultant specializing in media relations. Dave typically works in support of lobbying and campaign teams. He has ghostwritten dozens of opinion pieces on a variety of public policy issues that have appeared locally, regionally, and nationally. He's what's often referred to as a spin doctor, I think, on various issues. Dave is often called upon in crisis communications situations, as well as litigation support. He's written and produced scores of successful campaign ads for radio, television, and print. He worked for Governor Mike Leavitt. Dave also has appeared frequently. He appeared on Channel 4 on the Van Oka Group as well. And then, of course, we have with us the Chief of Police of Salt Lake City, Chris Burbank. Chris has been with the Salt Lake City Police Department since 1991. He was appointed Chief of Police in March of 2006. In 2014, Chief Burbank was selected as a member of the Enlightened 50 Most Influential Leaders in the state of Utah. In June of 2013, Chief Burbank was recognized by the Utah National Guard in their annual Minuteman Award for contributions to the well-being of Utah. Many awards and commendations. He was also the vice president, I guess past vice president, of the Major Cities Chiefs Association, an influential voice of police chiefs in the United States. Thank you all for being with us. We'll talk about police and the people. There's a microphone over there. Anytime any of you want to make a comment and ask a question or make a comment, please take the microphone right over there at any time during the discussion. You don't have to wait. Just go stand over there, line up. I'll call on you as I see you there, and we'll proceed. Just throughout the evening, you can ask a question. We only have an hour. We have to be done by 7:30, so get your questions in as soon as you can. There's unquestionably more unrest and conflict between police and people in communities across America right now. There have been incidents in Missouri with the shooting of Michael Brown. Eric Garner was put in a chokehold by police in New York and died as a result of that. Freddie Gray died in police custody in Baltimore. Those are the most obvious cases that have led to violence in the streets of those cities. The impression is that there is more going on right now. I think that's the impression. Is it accurate? Is it an accurate impression that there's more violence going on between people and police right now?
Well, first of all, remember that the country is much safer in general than it ever has been. But I do think that it's fairly obvious that you've got primarily I think it's hard to argue. You've got a racially diverse community that's having problems. I mean, the white communities just don't have the same situations that the minority communities do. And not being a minority, I can't tell you why, but my friends who are of minority races tell me that they simply don't feel like the police are part of them. It's a confrontational issue. The number of stories from, I have a particularly good friend of mine who's a black guy, and he tells me these stories about his interactions with the police all across the United States. And I look at him, and if it weren't the fact I know he's the most truthful guy on the planet, I wouldn't believe him. I would think we were back in the 60s, given the stories that he tells me about his dealings with the police. So there's clearly some issues there. The militarization issue is one, but there is a real problem between the police community and the minority community. And if we have, you mentioned the 60s, it's called the long hot summer. If you'll remember the long hot summer, if we have one of these events happen in an area, if the Baltimore cops get acquitted, for example, in August, I would not want to be in Baltimore.
Well, and if I can, I think one of the things that's very important is we have a system that is biased. There's no question about it. The criminal justice system is a biased system. We incarcerate people of color at a higher rate than anyone else. And when you look at drugs, alcohol, and mental health issues, we know that every community suffers from that. Why then are we incarcerating people of color, usually people of lower economic class, at a higher rate? And I think it's because what we've done is we've said, okay, there's where the crime is. And if I ask anyone in the audience, where's the crime in Salt Lake City? In and around the shelter. Who are we going to impact when we over-police an area? We now start encountering everybody. Hey, do you have any drugs on you tonight? You mind if I check you? Right? If I ask that question in any community and I get in his pockets, chances are pretty good that I may find something. Now, he ends up in jail for a low-level crime. Now, because of his ability to obtain an attorney and everything else, he may not spend any time in prison. But we have people that we've incarcerated, in some cases 500 times, for minor possession sort of things, alcohol charges, and it hasn't solved their problem.
But isn't it the case that people are abusing drugs and committing crimes on the east side of Salt Lake City just as much, if not more?
I think that's what he's saying.
Absolutely. And if we police at the same level in any community, we're going to find some of these exact same things.
Excuse me, I'd like to go back to what Bill asked. And since we have two people that actually know what they're talking about, and presumably some others in the audience, is that true? Is that perception true? I find in a lot of other areas that what is true is we now have an infinite number of channels funneling information to the public through all sorts of media 24/7, 365. And that certainly changes our perception. So I'd like to know, does anyone know what the stats are 2014 versus 1994?
The crime rate's way,
No, I
way
mean
down.
incidents between police and community members.
But we can't just talk about crime rate. We have to talk about racial disparities, wealth disparities, economic disparities, a culture. We know that people of color in our communities in America have generations of people being incarcerated and over-incarcerated. We have devastation of communities and people of color whose kids, and I appreciate Bill's story about officer friendly versus another person's experience, because the white guy grows up maybe with the officer friendly. A black male growing up in one of our inner cities does not see police officers as officer friendly. They know that that's who took away uncle. They know that's the AP&P officer that violated their parole. And I think what we know is increasing is economic disparities between the haves and the have-nots. And that's the difference between getting an attorney and not.
You're going deep and you're going to causation. What I'm asking is, are there more confrontations, violent, presumably involving the use of lethal or non-lethal force this year versus 20 years ago? I'm just curious to know.
So looking at Salt Lake City, we use less force in the last 10 years than we ever have, at least in the 26 years I've been involved in law enforcement and going back. I mean, we use absolutely a lot less force. In fact, we use deadly force a lot less. And I think across the nation, you're seeing the same dynamic that's taking place, but yet they're being highlighted more. And we never want to make excuse for bad police work. I mean, some of what you've seen on TV is ridiculous. And that person shouldn't be a police officer. They should be prosecuted. I mean, we're not making excuses for this, but we have confrontations that take place. What has changed, though, is the dynamic, the outcome, the confrontation that occurs between the public and the police when the police respond to crowds. And when we show up wearing riot gear, prepared for battle, it says throw rocks and bottles at us. And if that's where we start, then you have a very violent confrontation that is increasing.
And
The
that's
other
what I
thing
meant-
that's
what I
changed,
meant
though,
about
in the perception, Bruce, is this.
Well, that's, yeah, exactly. That's what I meant about the militarization of the police. That is certainly an issue. And part of the problem is this omnipresent media, because you brought up the Michael Brown situation. I almost wish you had avoided the Michael Brown situation because it highlights part of the problem. As a lawyer, you read the transcripts and you read the investigation of Michael Brown, and that is a completely different situation than the Tamir Rice murder in Cleveland. That 12-year-old kid was murdered. The Michael Brown, no one could possibly have convicted based off the facts that they had and the testimony. And that's part of the problem, is the press is covering everything, and you've got this barbell-style press, the crazy right, the crazy left, and very little in the middle with thoughtful analysis.
All right, the Michael Brown case is the Ferguson, Missouri case.
Correct.
Now, when I called up Chief Burbank and said, would you be on the panel? He said, I'd like to be on the panel. Yeah, and I just got back from Ferguson, Missouri. Why did you go to Ferguson, and what did you learn while you were there?
So I participate as part of a group, the Center for Policing Equity, and we look at inequity that exists in law enforcement and how we can look at bias and how we can reduce use of force and those types of things. So I was actually there just to participate and see how can you resolve the situation that exists there, right? We know what went on in the past. How do we change policing in that area? And what you find is a dynamic that you look at a small community that in some cases is just a few blocks that is now designated as a city. They don't provide street service, they don't provide fire service, but they have a police department and they write $1 million worth of tickets every year. Right? That creates a dynamic in a situation where the police are not there to help you, they're simply there to hand you another citation. And then when you look at what people are incarcerated for time and time again for very low-level crimes, that creates this feeling that, yeah, you're picking on me, right? There is a problem that time and time again, I'm going to jail for something that I don't feel I've done anything wrong. Or if you take that same and put it in a different community, yeah, you're going to arrest other people, but you're not. And that's where this inequity is created. And then it's years and years of we don't trust the police. There has to be a dialogue that takes place before.
Remember the old Willie Sutton line, the bank robber? Ask why he robbed banks. He says that's where the money is. If you give a set of police officers a task to write a certain number of tickets or to bring in a certain number of revenue, where is the easiest place to do that? The easiest place to do that isn't the Upper East Side of Salt Lake City, for example. It's not Sandy. It's places where you've got many more targets, a target-rich environment with people not able to protect themselves, people who are disfavored to begin with. And if you've got that mentality, and fortunately, from what I can tell, and I'm a happy Salt Lake City resident about this, the chief and Matt Knoll and everybody else before that have done a great job with the Salt Lake City Police Department. We don't seem to have those problems, but other cities do.
There are a couple of issues about Ferguson that as I looked into it, I found kind of interesting, and maybe we can ask what Salt Lake City, how it compares or does not compare. The police force in Ferguson, predominantly a white police force. The residents predominantly not white. So there's that issue to deal with. What is the police force in Salt Lake in terms of its minority makeup?
Well, we are certainly under where our Hispanic or Latino representation should be. that population has grown dramatically. In fact, we're looking at avenues that we can have people who are not citizens of the United States come work for the police department, because I think we need to be represented in that community. And it is difficult right now, in light of the discussion that has taken place in this state on immigration. If you're a Latino person, do you want to come work for the police department on the chance that you're going to be an immigration agent? No. And in light of what's going on in the nation as far as all people of color, do you want to be the person who's the police officer? So recruiting is not going to be going this way anytime soon, and so it is a tremendous challenge in which we need to change how we do business. I appreciate your comment. What I will never guarantee is that I don't have bias within the police department. But what I have to ensure as the administrator is that I'm not interjecting bias. Right? If I send people out and say, enforce license plate violations, well, I'm not going to write anyone on this panel a ticket. But if I go over into the West Side where people don't understand English as a second language, we don't publish rules of the road in a language other than English, so they have license plates on their car. So we now pull them over, we impound the car, we take it away. Well, who are we now impacting? Because I said let's enforce license plate violations. So those are the subtle things that we need to look at, implicit bias that exists within everybody, that if we just send out blindly, go do this, that's where you create these situations that you see long-term distrust that occurs in many, many cities throughout the nation.
Let me ask this question too, and maybe Dr. Butters can address
Yeah, you can't be
this.
shy in this group.
No, jeez, you got to get right in there, don't you?
Let me ask this question to Dr. Butters, and then we'll come right to you, okay? As I read also about Ferguson, they talked specifically about the officer that shot Michael Brown. And they said it's entirely possible that, so when this officer sees Michael Brown, he doesn't see a person. He sees a black person. That's what he sees first, a black person. He sees, and that's something that he fears.
He sees that person immediately as someone who is a risky person that needs to be attended to.
Yeah.
And that's not police officers. That's our whole society. Like, let's just talk about, so what's important to know is that law enforcement and the criminal justice system takes place in the context of our larger biases and racism within our culture. It just gets magnified.
So is there some sort of training? How can we train not just police officers, but maybe ourselves to say, okay, I see a person there, now let's deal with it that way, rather than...
I think anybody who says they have no racial bias, and I've always taught this to my children, anybody who says that is a liar.
Yeah,
It's simply not possible not to have some sort of prejudice. What matters is how you're willing to treat everyone that you come across. And I think that applies to police officers as well. I can't always control the thoughts in my mind. I can control what comes out of my mouth.
It's like
and I can control whether I'm fair and balanced with people.
It's like Stephen Colbert made that great joke. They tell me I'm white. Right, okay.
And the issue is maybe, but not only do we need to try to treat people fair, but we need to recognize that there's this overlay of bias in every interaction that we have. So we can try to be fair to everybody. That's just not the case. I'm going to be more fair with people who are like me than not. That's the reality.
What's your name, sir, and what's your question?
My name's Paul. According to the Salt Lake Tribune, it said that, let me pull this up actually. It said that police killings ranked second only to intimate partners in the state of Utah. So I was just wondering, why do they typically go for their gun first? I understand if the person has a gun, but why not tase them? Why is that number so high, first of all, to only be surpassed by intimate partners? And then also, why do they go for their gun more often than their taser?
Okay, so this is a good question. And in fact, this is where we talked about a little bit in the media bias. So every year in Salt Lake City, right, we average over the last 10 years around 2 shootings per year. Some years we have none. One year we have 3, 1. We always have 10 times more homicides than that. So that is not reflective and it's not accurate. Any period in time, if I say, all right, January was the most deadly month ever because so many people died or whatever it is, you have to look historically and at least take some context in. What you're seeing is a dynamic as the valley grows. You're seeing what used to be exclusive to Salt Lake City is now happening in some of these other neighborhoods. So I do not believe that is an accurate statement that takes place. But your question, which is really where we need to get to, is how do we train our police officers to respond? Things like crisis intervention, which is a mental health program that we teach officers. How to deal with those people intoxicated. How to de-escalate situations as you show up on them is where we need to focus, as opposed to always being at that hyper-vigilant, right? I'm going to take some sort of action and control the situation. Now, when you tase and when you don't, I mean, the statute is really pretty clear, right? I have to be able to say my life is in danger or his life's in danger, so I use this force in order to immediately stop that danger, right? And so that's the criteria that's very high, and that's where we need to judge individually. And I will never say that every shooting that occurs is a good shooting, right? But we need to look at those individually as opposed to this large, broad brush, everybody falls into this category. And then you ask those questions. Why in this circumstances, right? What are you teaching that allowed this to take place? And then improve upon that. So, I mean, that is a challenge not only for Salt Lake City and Utah, but throughout the entire nation, is how do we now change the dynamic in policing where our first response is not always showing up looking like we're ready for a fight?
How useful are all of these recent shootings? Cameras have played a big part in that. Police officers have been locally here, have been wearing cameras. Mr. Barker, I think it was, up in the avenues, your officer was wearing a camera there. The young man that was shot at the 7-Eleven, the officer was wearing a camera there. How useful were the cameras that the officers were wearing, and what are the implications of wearing cameras?
Well, unfortunately, the dialogue in the nation's turned to if you have a camera, it's going to prevent shootings. It's not, right? It's going to document what takes place. And so the only time that I would say it would prevent a shooting is if you have someone who's blatantly going to violate the law. They may think twice because they're being videotaped. But these that are very difficult situations that could go either way, that, if we took a vote on this panel, you'd say, oh, that one's a good one, no, this one's a bad one. But it documents, right? It provides an avenue by which the public can say, we agree or we disagree, right? And then once we come to that point, then we decide, what are we sending our officers on? What's our expectation when we show up? Huge discussion takes place. We need to get some depth in this conversation and say, all right, what are we sending our officers on? And what is the expectation when they show up? We had an incident where somebody, a young man ran into his own home with a gun and threatened some people. So they all ran out of the house, called the police and said, go in and get him. Well, we may shoot him if we go in there and he has intention. Or do you want us to fill your house full of gas? Or should we go away and wait?
Part of the problem, I think, Bill, is that like all generals always fight the last war. We've been, since 3 strikes you're out in California and broken windows policing, which may have had some validity at a time of much higher crime rates, we've established a confrontational mentality in a lot of cities' police departments that now no longer fits the reality of where we are with the crime rates. We've also over-criminalized a lot of things. Drugs are the obvious, drugs, addiction. We've gotten away from criminalizing mental health, sort of, but we still have those problems as they relate to addiction. And I don't think we've adjusted in either the police or the civilian model in many cities, from what you read, to that new world. And we're still in that old line where if you're a carpenter and you only have a hammer, then you see everything is a nail. And a lot of the times, the police apparently in other cities see every black man as a criminal, every Hispanic as a criminal, and you just can't do that. And on the other hand, the minority community sees the police always as the popo, the enemy, and you can't deal with that either. And it's a significant educational problem. It's going to take a lot of time. There's some movement. The Department of Justice has moved to fund $1.5 million over the last few months as to de-escalation tactics. I think you're going to start seeing a lot of, and I sent you that link, I
Well,
think.
there was I think you sent it to me. There was an article about Cleveland.
Right.
They said, okay, no more pistol whipping suspects.
Yeah.
We can't do that anymore.
Cleveland's the poster child of evil right
Yeah.
now with that Tamir Rice murder. I
Yeah.
mean, that was a flat, I mean, how do you kill a 12-year-old kid by pulling up and 3 seconds later shooting him?
Yeah.
I mean, what worries me, however, is things like Boston and Cleveland. If we have some acquittals, you're going to see Rodney King all over again. If we have some acquittals this summer of these racially charged shootings, you almost saw that in Cleveland last time.
I don't know what it is, and I don't know what you tell your officers, but I suspect I know. It's not against the law to run from the police. It's not.
There's actually some interesting case law, and under some circumstances, and I disagree with it completely, but under some circumstances, running is a probable cause. There is some case law. Seems very weird to me, but if you Google probable cause running away, it's factually based. And I'm not a criminal defense lawyer, but I read everything.
The biggest challenge in training police officers is when to just walk away.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because we view that, and you think about this, the public views that. What's your expectation when you call the police? If they just say, hey, I'm not going to do anything. In fact, I had some people get very upset when I walked past a homeless man sleeping on the sidewalk one day. Shook him, said, you okay, bud? Yep, good. He's not violating the law. Yeah, he doesn't look nice sitting there, but I'm not going to make him move. But to walk away, right, when to turn and say, yeah, this isn't a violation of the law, and it's not something we should be involved in.
Disengaging and de-escalating conflict is a lot harder than escalating and engaging in conflict.
Anybody can escalate.
Anybody can
Absolutely.
escalate. It takes real skill to de-escalate.
What's your name and what's your question?
Dale Bohm, and I'm an attorney. I work mainly with people with disabilities. The lion's share of my work is with people who are deaf. I will tell you this, body cams are excellent. they are a
agree
great
with you.
piece of equipment, and for both positive and negative. I will tell you that. I have had many cases where the police have said, this is what happened, and we look at the body cam video, and that is what happened. I work with clients with mental illness. I work with clients who are deaf. One of the problems I have is we talk about race, and I'm sorry to kind of pull it off of that into a disability, but disability, we have sort of a hidden issue that's going on, and I would say rampant. 2 weeks ago, I had to intervene in a situation where the police were using a 7-year-old girl to interpret between her parents in a domestic violence situation. And when I pointed out to them how absolutely insane that was, they looked at me, and a police officer looked at me and said, I don't care. This is the easiest way of taking care of it. It's illegal under the Americans with Disabilities Act, but my biggest issue that I have is training of the police officers and policy. I'm also a professor at Utah Valley University, and we took a poll and looked around at the policies for dealing with people with disabilities in different police agencies around the state. One of the more interesting things that came out is it's, for example, for sign language interpreters or dealing with deaf, it said dealing with deaf criminals. It had absolutely nothing in the police policy of dealing with deaf citizens. All the policies, almost to a policy, said when dealing with a deaf criminal. So all the police were being trained to do is treat deaf people as criminals. When they came in, they saw the sign language, they saw the person was deaf, they were instantly a suspect because the only thing they'd been trained to do is deal with them as a criminal. My question is, how much time is being devoted right now to training police officers to deal with and de-escalate these situations, specifically of mental illness, specifically of deafness, these non-overt, less obvious disabilities?
So quite a bit of time is being dedicated, but the challenge that you have, and it's a mistake of my profession, and we've made it time and time again, and the example is tasers, right? Stun devices. When they first came out, you saw in the nation that some people, if you looked at me sideways, that was justification to use a taser, and some said it was a substitute for deadly force. Well, neither one was right. And what we generated is all kinds of bad case law, unfortunate incidents, and even some deaths. that occurred from that, which is a tragic thing. We're in the middle, and active resistance is where we need to be. When you talk about policy, why do we not have uniform policies, at least throughout the state, if not throughout the nation, especially as it pertains to deadly force and some of these other things? So you're seeing some steps, and I'm participating at a national level. Department of Justice is looking at some best practices. We're starting to come up with some of these, but that's where we need to move. What is the best practice for responding to a crowd, a gathering, right? And because 50 people show up on your doorstep, that does not constitute a riot. Right? And there's a big difference between how you respond to a riot and how you respond to a gathering of people. And those are the types of things that we need to discuss and come to a better conclusion. And that's partly what we're fighting now across the nation. My policy is different than the 15 other jurisdictions that exist in the Valley.
Oh, it is.
Oh, yeah, I know. And so, and there's some circumstances where I say best practice, yep, we're right there. Other things we may be lacking on that we need to develop and work on that. But at least at a state level, we should be working on the same policy. So you as a citizen know, no matter where you travel in this county or in this state, you are going to be treated fairly, right? And there's going to be recourse, and there's going to be civilian review, and there's going to be some camera evidence that exists that is accessible to the public. If we had that, boy, we'd be miles ahead of anywhere else in the nation.
Now, there was that unfortunate situation a few years ago with Cardall down in southern Utah. Who had not taken his medication.
The Supreme Court actually last week made a decision out of a case out of San Francisco called Sheehan, a woman who was mentally ill. The police showed up because to do basically a welfare check, to check and see if she was, they said she wasn't eating and she wasn't dressing herself. And they came in and she picked up a butter knife. They backed off and called for backup and then went back in. Her psychiatrist had said she's not a danger to herself, or she's not a danger to herself. She may be a danger to others, but there wasn't anybody else there. And so they went in. She held up the butter knife. She came across the room at her, and they shot her.
Yeah.
She survived.
But that question came up actually in a narrow factual context under whether the Americans with Disability Act applied into that situation.
And they sidestepped it.
But it's not really relevant to the overall policing issues. It was very narrow technical legal issues.
It is, but it brings up the discussion of should we respond to those circumstances?
Sure. It's
I mean,
the engage question
yes.
that we talked about.
The issue is we're recognizing finally that not everyone responds the same way. And in these very volatile situations where you have an armed law enforcement agent, you can't deal the same way with someone with a disability, with someone who's high on drugs, that has a mental illness, that's a person of color. Is we need to have tailored ways to respond to them that is going to be effective in creating that helpful police officer. That's a tall order, Chief. I mean, that's a tall order to be able to say, we need to respond in a way that creates community safety and do what we need to do, but we also recognize for individual differences and especially for disabilities and
You're never going to get it 100% right.
No,
I mean,
because we're dealing with people, right? No matter what the circumstances is, it involves two people or more, and to get light discussion or even mindset is very difficult.
Do police officers need to have degrees in psychology, the law, and need to be paid way more money than they? I mean, it seems to be an almost impossible situation sometimes.
I mean, if you're asking for Mike, do they need training? Do they need to understand how to respond to a person that's deaf and not use someone to interpret? Of course they need that. So do we need law enforcement officers to be trained in how to shoot a gun and in how to have good people skills and de-escalation? Of course, and that's the direction I see law enforcement going. When we do research and training, we got school resource officers that are recognizing, hey, don't bust a kid because he's sagging his pants anymore. We need to talk to these kids, do some more community-oriented policing where these kids start to see you as someone they can trust, a resource, a person that can create more safety for them.
Yes, Dr. White.
My name's Paul White, and appreciate the discussion and have tons of comments and questions, but I'll keep them brief.
Can you get a little closer to the microphone?
One of the things I was thinking about, going back to Dave's point of the media and the perception, just a quick comment. If you think about Cleveland, they just acquitted a police officer there for a shooting at the same time that the Cleveland police force was getting slammed for their practices. But if you think about without Michael Brown's death, without Freddie Gray's death, without the death in New York, these were places and situations in which people were already speaking about police confrontations and everything, that it took those deaths for it to come to light. But it may be more, actually, I think the perception may be underserved. It may be going on more that we don't know about, or we don't seem to know about, because the media aren't covering all the aspects of it. But my questions and comments, or questions, one is thinking about the community. With the police officers in Salt Lake City, I'm not for sure how they're assigned to different areas of the city, if they're rotated or not, but I've read reports where in some cities what they're doing is they're sending the newer police officers to the quote-unquote worst parts of town to kind of break them in. And if you think about, you've got new people and potentially bad situations, that's not a good mix. And I didn't know how Salt Lake City does that. Second community kind of related question is also thinking about if the police officers are living in the communities in which they're patrolling. A number of places that may help to de-escalate some of the situations and create the more officer-friendly, that the people in the neighborhood, in the areas, get to know the police officers, and the police officers get to know the people in the neighborhoods. And third, I know there are civilian review boards and community review boards, and I didn't know how often they meet, how often that information gets disseminated out to the public for when they're not just thinking of big shooting crimes, but even these little incidents that you were talking about.
Have you got all that?
Yeah, I got it all.
Okay.
I got it dialed.
Okay, number one, do police officers, do you break them in by sending them to bad neighborhoods?
Well, let me first say that we don't have bad neighborhoods in Salt Lake City. And this is all seriousness. There is nowhere in this city. I have 3 teenagers that run around this city on a regular basis. There's nowhere that I say don't go. Right? They routinely go down to the Gateway and walk through, and Rio Grande Cafe. I mean, they're everywhere. We are very, very fortunate. But we do not, what we try and do is to rotate our police officers. It is always a balancing act. And what you find in these big cities, very strong labor unions dictate how you deploy resources and what shifts they work and all those other things. We have a little bit of that, but what you try and do is introduce them, and you have to socialize police officers into the organization and what the expectation is. And that socialization for me is the day they walk in the door, they sit in my office and hear what my expectations are. And I make decisions before I ever say, yeah, you can go into the class, as to whether or not they're allowed to go, based on are they articulate and do I think they can empathize. Now, I may miss that sometimes, but at least somebody's looking at it, and then you continually work on that all the way through.
Chief, I want to ask you a question about that, because it's something that Bill talked about. When I was a kid, and most of us here grew up, most of the guys on the panel probably grew up in the same relatively privileged area. The police I dealt with when I was a kid in a very small town, they weren't so much in the cars. They were almost omnipresent on foot and available, and you saw them, and it had a, I'm lost, how do I get home? My dog's lost, how do I get home? Interaction, as opposed to only seeing them when something goes bad. And you see them pull up with sirens blaring and lights flashing and guns drawn, and you only see them in a scary situation now, and it leads to a dichotomy of interaction, and I think that's a real problem. Part of what Paul was talking about with the neighborhood policing. I mean, it strikes me as something that I know Salt Lake City does it somewhat, but on the Upper East Side of it,
Cop on the corner,
I mean, it's sort of the cop on the beat, yeah.
Really briefly, I mean, it's the evolution of policing, right? We had officers, and that was corruption, so now we invented police cars and radios, and just the facts, ma'am, and that was what we built the nation on in the 60s and 70s, is you're just responding to the emergency, right? And you show up and you take care of business, and then you go away. Then we developed in this community policing, and that was, we'll take 10 officers, and they're the nice, friendly officers, and the rest of us can be thugs, right? What we've done now, or what you try and do, is everybody is the same, right? no matter if they talk to the police chief, that's why I wear a uniform all the time, or they talk to one of my officers, they should get the same high-level quality of service. And it should be, we're part of the community we serve, right? When we stand apart, we're no good. We need to participate. If we are just there when there's a problem, then we have a bigger problem than we can handle.
And what was it, did we cover all of it?
No, Civilian Review Board, we got to hit this one.
Yeah.
There is not a police agency in this nation that should not have some sort of civilian review process in place. So for us, every single case that comes in, whether generated internally or externally to the police department, is handed to the Civilian Review Board. They don't work for me. They're appointed out of the mayor's office. They have their own independent investigator. They decide what they want to listen to. They can ask questions, call witnesses, conduct an interview or an investigation, and then they give me a recommendation as to what they think. There should be civilian review process in everything. I mean,
how much is the code of silence among police officers an issue that you see something and you don't say it about your fellow officer?
Well,
and I'm not talking about just Salt Lake City, because Salt Lake City seems to be fortunate in its policing, but everything you read about the policing in the big city where there's a lot of racial segregation / diversity, the code of silence is a serious problem.
well, the scariest thing that I saw in the video out of South Carolina is not that the officer shot that young man. It's the man who the cop that stands over as he watches him throw that and doesn't even flinch.
That was the guy that was running away.
Yes. Now that indicates some problem. So what you want to ask, and I do a lot of this for different groups that come in and look at police agencies, how many investigations, internal investigations, are generated from within?
Right.
So for Salt Lake City, about 65% of all complaints that come into the police department are generated by police department employees.
What's
so
the,
we're
what's
doing a
the
pretty
normal
good
average? What's the
well,
average?
it drops. It all depends where you are in the country
Well,
and
that's my
kind of what's
point.
going on. And so it drops down to where it's 25 or less. And so when you ask somebody, how many cases did you investigate last year? And they say none, there's a
You got a
problem
problem.
there.
Yes, sir. What's your name and what's...
Hi, I'm Jason Lee. I'm a resident of Sandy. And because we have short time and this lady wants to speak, I'll just get down to a couple of things. One is, I'm always disappointed because as my experience as a black person, I grew up on the south side of Chicago, I don't trust the police. Not that I don't like them, I just don't trust them. And because my experience has been that they treat me poorly. I've been arrested for a traffic violation. I have to run that around in my head to think, for a traffic violation, really? And my experience has been colored by that, no pun intended. So I wonder, though, why more officers, and I give you credit, Chief, at least today, you speak out against these officers that commit what obviously are crimes. When you stand on top of a police car and shoot 15 times into it, and nobody was shooting back at you, and somehow you don't get convicted of a crime, that's ridiculous. When you shoot someone in the back, and obviously murder them, when you choke them to death, and having a camera didn't matter. They didn't even get indicted. What do we do about those prosecutors who decide it's not worth indicting them? They haven't even crossed the threshold that they need to be charged with a crime when the rest of us are outraged, particularly someone like me, because that could be me. It may not be you guys, but certainly it could be me.
Isn't that the question of the law, not the prosecutor?
Well, no, some of it's the prosecutor. You got to give Sim credit for guts in indicting that West Valley officer.
Sim Gill, the Salt Lake County prosecutor.
That took guts.
He looks into all those cases. He's looked into every case that's happened here. He looked into the Avenues case.
They fall under his jurisdiction to determine whether or not they're in violation
He
of the
looked
law.
into the West Valley case, the young woman who was shot by
The Daniel
the
Willard
two.
case.
But I know Sim well, and he's not a big interpreter of the law. He's a big follower of the law.
Yeah.
Exactly. He looks at the facts.
You know,
And he, of all of those cases, the Danielle Willard case is the one that he said there seems to be a question here as to whether this was a justified
I'd
shooting.
like to
or not.
talk about, the question I have is
So-
I'd like to get, I would really like to understand the chicken and egg thing. A couple of things bother me. One is the militarization of the police. I enjoyed, did you see the Economist article when they
Yes.
talked about now they don't salute anymore? Their job is to go up and start a conversation with their
Right.
superior.
Really good article.
Again, trying to train people on how to interact with the public. I don't know who armed first, the bad guys or the good guys, but I think the armament has really accelerated. I wouldn't want to litigate each of these particular incidents. I'd like to throw to the chief, because this is just a great opportunity for me to ask you a question. On the Ferguson, on Michael Brown, if that young man had been shot while he was reaching into the patrolman's vehicle, then I would have understood that. The problem that I had with that shooting is the suspect had disengaged. He was not armed, and yet that officer chose to get out of his vehicle. I mean, why wasn't that a case? And I want to talk globally, not just about this guy. If you were training your officers, why would the answer not be exactly what you were saying earlier? You now have a radio and a cell phone. You have a vehicle you can follow this 6'4", 280-pound man. Why was the choice, and he was within the law, but legal don't mean right. Why was the choice to shoot him instead of disengage, let him go on his way, get back up?
Well, so very good question, and one I can't
and
speak
take
for
that more
his
global
mind.
in terms of training and where we are.
Well, what we have to do is it starts with public expectation, right? One is we have this funny thing that we call the cops take care of business and it's over and done with, right? The expectation is you take the person away. So then you have to now say, all right, police officer, your job is not to show up, right, and just be the big hammer. Sometimes it is to back away from things, right? Sometimes the best solution is to not be involved at all. So a perfect example, had a group of people that wanted to protest the police department, right? They kept jumping in the roadway. Well, how much should my officers get in the middle of people who want to protest standing in a roadway?
I think that's a case for Dr. Darwin.
Well, but I mean, those are the types of things. When we had the protest group, the D. Christopher thing, right? We blocked traffic in downtown Salt Lake for 35 minutes, arrested 17 people without incident. I got an award for that really should have gone to my police officers. But I had 100 phone calls come into my office. How dare you allow them to block traffic? You should have arrested them immediately.
My favorite story of that ilk was, I grew up in Ogden, and there was a man up there, a wonderful guy, Reverend Harris. And Reverend Harris is an old black preacher up there, and Reverend Harris used to like to protest anything and everything. And periodically he would protest something, and he would protest by laying down in the middle of the busiest street in town, Washington Boulevard. And when he would do that, he'd say, I'm going to go protest, and he'd call the cops, and the cops would go put traffic cones around Reverend Harris, and he would lay down in the middle of Washington Boulevard for 20 minutes or so, and they'd stand there and put traffic cones around him, and he was satisfied, and the cops were satisfied,
But,
and then
you
he'd
know,
go
that,
home.
that brings up a greater point, and it is that willingness to disengage and not believe that you always have to dominate the situation.
But look, we got to recognize we have some significant racial problems in some cities with some police departments. Read the Matt Taibbi book, The Divide, and look at the difference and the shocking oppression, and it just doesn't work in some cities. And I'm predicting, I got $100 in my pocket, we're going to have a major city riot burn this year.
That cop in Ferguson, he had to see it through. He felt that he had to see that situation.
Machismo.
He had to see that situation through.
That's what I'm saying.
That
was what bothered me about that one.
And he was wrong. He was within the law somehow, but he was wrong. Yep, ma'am, what's your name? And
My name's Martha, and this is going a slightly different direction, but I want to ask a quick question and then a follow-up question. Quick question, one-word answer. When you guys were in trouble as kids, who did you go to, mom or dad?
Mom.
went to my mother. My dad had beat the shit out
I
of me.
would much prefer my mom.
Mom.
All right, I think everyone said mom. So the follow-up question is, what are you doing with your female officers? Because I think females in general are viewed as more trustworthy. Certainly not in every situation, but as a general. What are you doing with your female officers to perhaps build that trust with the community?
Well, so my spokespeople are female officers for the most part. And the challenge is I don't have nearly enough female officers to send out there. But statistically, they use force a lot less than their male counterparts. In fact, there's a very good study that was done about the male machismo need to intercede and their quickness to use force as opposed to their female counterparts. I mean, it is in our genetic makeup. And now you put two males against each other who have this little standoff thing going. And no, you're exactly right. I mean, it's very perceptive of you. And in fact, we don't see some of these same problems with female officers.
Get in a fight or flight machismo situation with two people who are heavily armed or unarmed, it's not a good situation.
No, it is devastating to how we do business, and we need to change this dynamic, and not just, it needs to be a professional change. If my profession doesn't change, your money is good money on the riot that's going to occur because of that. We need to make some dramatic changes. And if there's anyone in my profession that doesn't believe we either need to or that we are going to be forced to, is naive. We need to change how we do business in order to legitimize ourselves.
You know, and this goes along with just the larger movement of the justice reinvestment, which is getting smart about how we deal with crime and addiction. We can't just arrest our way out of it. We can't incarcerate our way out of these problems. We have to get people treatment. We have to recognize that there's disparities and give people the resources. That's why you can't arrest homeless people. We can't arrest homeless people and lock them up in jail and expect that deals with our homeless problem. We have some great initiatives here that have taken a different approach to that. So like law enforcement have taken a very different approach in how they talk to the homeless populations, that everybody just wants the heck out of their neighborhood. Well, we realize, well, we need to offer these folks resources.
We also have to deal with the economic problems. I mean, it is a socioeconomic situation. The numbers are not just racial, they're racial and economic class bias. And, and you look at the statistics and you correlate them, and it's back to what I said, you rob banks because that's where the money is. I mean, that's where the incidents are, partly because there's no hope. I mean, if you've got a community with no jobs and people on the street with nothing to do during the day because they can't get employment, what do you think's going to happen?
And people who are addicted, that rather than offering treatment resources, we put them in prisons and jails.
And they can't get a job because they've been arrested, and then you've got the racial bias to begin with.
It's very difficult to recover.
We're just about out of time. Did you have something very quickly, please?
You can't let me cut off just like that, you know? Hi, Chief. Well, I have a question. My name is Tony Yapias, and I think we've been talking a lot about what the police need to do in terms of, doing a better job and all that. But one of the things after we see everything that's been happening around the country, the question to me is, what can we do from the community? I mean, as community members, as citizens, what can we do better to work, to have better relations with the police? You know, I really appreciate Chief Burbank here, because he's done a lot of outreach with the Latino community. I believe, I trust him. I trust his officers. I live in the city, and I know that every time I have an opportunity to interact with a Salt Lake City police officer, at least, you know, I feel like I'm very friendly with them. And so, I guess, what is the expectation from police, from us in the community? So.
Well, the thing that I enjoy most, and why this will be the last place that I work in law enforcement, is the fact that we have the ability to have some very volatile, sometimes angry discussion that takes place, and protests and the same things occur, but we have the ability to discuss, right? And it does not turn into, I don't show up wearing riot gear, and they don't show up ready to throw rocks and bottles at us. And we have a discussion, and we can actually say, what do you want to accomplish tonight? And that's what makes a difference.
Do you think your job, do you feel your job is more dangerous now than it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago?
No.
No, you feel good?
Statistically, it isn't. Statistically, police officers are safer than they've ever been.
The 90s were all-time incarceration, crime, officer-involved shootings, and officers killed. I mean, those were very scary times.
I would just add, what can we do as community members? We need to acknowledge the fact that we are part of this system, and we need to have a dialogue with folks, and to polarize law enforcement against people of color and make it that simple, it just simply isn't true or productive. And recognize the law enforcement officers that work in our communities, they're our kids. We raised them, you know, so we need to take responsibility for some of that as well.
That's it. I want to thank you all for being here. Bruce Baird, Dave Owen, Rob Butters, Chief Chris Burbank. I want to thank our technical staff, Ty Cummins, Jessica Baird for taking pictures, Eric Stoddard on sound, Mike Waldvogel and John Ribera, and everybody here at 50 West Club and Cafe. The show is produced by Dylan Allred and Corey O'Brien. Remember to like What Do You Think Utah on Facebook. Follow us at Think Utah on Twitter. Next month we'll do this again. If you like the show, please join us on June 24th. We'll be talking about health care in Utah.
Oh, dear.
You want to do that, Dave?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I'll invite you, and you better be ready for me to get up on your grill about it.
I have
All
no
right?
doubt.
Thanks for coming, everybody. Thanks, everybody out there, for watching. If you were watching online, please come again. Good night.